The tragic story of Gabby Petito captured the attention of the world, but beyond the headlines, it revealed something far more insidious: the hidden nature of domestic violence and coercive control. Gabby's case shed light on the devastating consequences of emotional abuse, the misidentification of victims, and the systemic failures that can leave survivors vulnerable. For FITSNews, I'm Callie Lyons. Today, we're joined by Brian Bennett, a retired South Carolina state law enforcement officer and domestic violence training expert, to discuss the warning signs of abuse, the role of law enforcement, and how we can better support victims before it's too late. We'll examine the red flags present in Gabby's relationship, the complexities of trauma responses, and the urgent need for greater awareness and intervention. Through this conversation, we hope to educate, inform, and empower those who may be experiencing abuse or who want to help someone who is. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you again to express some very important information that hopefully every viewer will be able to carry in and use to their benefit and the benefit of others.
Unfortunately, we all know someone in this situation. So, do you have any opening thoughts about the Gabby Petito case?
Well, certainly Gabby's case brought about a huge national discussion and awareness to something that most people are unfamiliar with. You mentioned that we all know somebody, but most people have to perhaps think a little bit. But what the rates tell us is that about a third of people, about 33%, have experienced domestic violence directly. Another third knows someone who has experienced domestic violence. And the last third haven't experienced in either one of those forms yet, but will likely experience it to some degree in the future. So for those who have not lived in this area or worked in this profession where they deal with domestic violence on a regular basis, they were probably caught off guard to some degree by watching that Gabby Petito documentary or watching that case on the news as it unfolded. But even without formal training, most people were likely able to pick up on the issues that existed there. And interestingly, for those that have watched the Netflix documentary, Gabby and Brian were in Charleston, South Carolina at some point during their relationship. And the reason that we know this is because there was a recovered photo found in Brian Laundrie's belongings in a waterproof bag that was found not too far from his body. And that picture was of them in Charleston near the famous pineapple fountain there. But it caused me to think, what if that homicide that was ultimately by strangulation, what if that homicide happened in South Carolina? What if instead of Utah, that entire event occurred here? What abuse, if any, was she going through while she was here? And I started thinking about other cases that actually happened here in South Carolina. One most recently was the case of Blake Linkus and Natalie Martin. They were both residents of Ohio, but were visiting Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on vacation. And there he strangled her to death on vacation. He recently pled guilty to that charge. And then we have a case that actually occurred in Texas with Krista Bauer Gilley, who was a pregnant mother who was strangled to death by her husband in Houston, Texas, but they were both formerly from Charleston, South Carolina. So I think it just reinforces that these incidents occur anywhere and everywhere, and it could have started here and progressed elsewhere, or started somewhere else and come here to South Carolina. So if nothing else, it just reinforce that these instances can be happening anywhere and everywhere right under our noses, and we may not know about it, but when we do know about it, what can we do to fix it or correct it or make that situation better?
What do people often misunderstand about domestic violence?
Well, I think the biggest misunderstanding is that victims choose to be abused or seek out abusers. Victims of domestic violence, or what other states call intimate partner violence, is um, those individuals are manipulated by very clever abusers, and these abusers have refined their craft over time through progressive relationships to determine what works and what doesn't. There isn't any type of academic or systematic approach on the abuser's part. It's just life experiences that have taught them how to manipulate and control another person for their benefit, and not for the benefit of whom they're with. So abusers seek out those who they can control. In early stages of a relationship, if an abuser is met by a strong-willed person who is confident in themselves, has their own resources separate and apart from the abuser, those abusers often move on. And the picture that I try to present to maybe explain this a little bit better for people that aren't familiar is, think of the predatory nature of animals. So more specifically, let's think of, like, the plains of Africa. There's herds of impalas out there and all kind of wildebeest and that sort of thing. But if you think about the lions and the hyenas, those predators out there, when they see this giant herd of potential targets, they're not going after the strongest, the biggest, the ones that are surrounded by a mass of other creatures. What they're doing is they're looking for anything out of the ordinary where one of those animals is isolated, they don't have support, they're not paying attention, maybe there's some type of infirmity that animal is suffering. So that's the predatory nature of all abusers, is to go on the hunt and look and for their prey. And so that's why I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings. It's not the victim that sought out to be abused or controlled. It's the predatory nature of the abuser to seek out people that they can manipulate. And I tell people also too that these relationships, when they don't start off with these violent and controlling tendencies. I mean, if the first date you ever went on was somebody punching you in the face, you wouldn't go out with them again. So everybody puts that kind of best foot forward, that best presentation. And for abusers, that's the way to kind of get the hooks in real quick, as I call it. Get those hooks in where those emotional connections are made, where the best image of themselves is what is related to. And then it becomes much harder later on. And we'll talk about it. It becomes much harder later on for people that are targets of abuse to break that relationship. And leaving these relationships truly is the most dangerous part of these relationships, is the time of decision of when and how to get out.
Well, what are some key red flags that friends and family members, or even law enforcement, should be looking for in potentially abusive relationships?
Yeah. So again, going back to those that were watching the documentaries and perhaps didn't have an understanding, I think after watching these, a lot of people were sitting there going, wow, looking at the totality in the totality of circumstances, if you will. People may not have been able to put their articulate it well or put their fingers on it, but they were like, man, there was a lot of things there that were very troubling when we see the full picture. First of all, everything Brian did was sweet and considerate in Gabby's eyes, but others were picking up on the oddities he displayed. If you listen to the friends and family in those documentaries, they were the first ones to tell us something was wrong. But why? And the reason is because they were looking at things objectively and not through the lens of emotion. And love makes people do weird things, even to their own detriment. And so one of those things is just being aware. And when individuals are in a relationship, they don't always see things as clearly as those around the relationship. They were friends and family were picking up on Brian's persona that was contrary to what Gabby had expressed. So there's one of the red flags. She was talking about how wonderful he is and how engaging that he was, but people didn't find that to be true when he was around, or where they were in a group type setting. And so they found that a bit awkward. And it was this dichotomy between his private self, as was explained by Gabby, and this public self, which he saw, or which people saw when he was around. So that's one of those first things, is an awareness of, are there some discrepancies? Are there some differences between what has been told and conveyed versus what has been actually experienced by those friends and family? Another thing was the limited communication. Gabby seemed to have a very open relationship and very communicative nature with her parents and her step parents. They seemed to get along very well. But after development of this very fast moving relationship, they found that communication start to wane quite significantly. It was dramatic to a degree. It wasn't something that was subtle, and this is something that also troubled them. So when communication that is known to be normal starts dropping off and becoming abnormal, that's a key indicator there. The social isolation. Again, the friends and family, abusers know that friends and family are going to see things because of the lens that they're looking through versus the person in the relationship. Abusers know this, and so what they'll do is they will create situations where the victim becomes isolated from those that would observe. Now, it can happen two ways. One sometimes is forcing the victim to make a decision. Look, and they'll use the love and the emotion to do that. Hey, look, if you love me like you say you do, you'll spend more time with me than with your family. You show me by your actions what's your priority. And if you don't have me as the priority, then I'm going to go the other way. So they kind of again put a demanding behavior on that victim. The other thing that they could do is that they create so much chaos in the familiar relationship that the family decides to isolate and step away. We didn't see this too much with the Gabby Petito case, but in other situations I've seen, again, that the abuser causes so much chaos that the family themselves say, the supportive family says, you know what, we can't deal with this anymore. If you choose to have this person around, we're just going to go the other way. Well, that's what the abuser is counting on. And so when you have the social isolation, not only do you not have these observers, but you don't have the actual support structure of the friends and family there who could offer housing, who could offer financial assistance, who could offer some element of safety. So they're no longer around. A fast moving relationship that requires a deep commitment early on. Truly, it takes time to know and understand people that you're have an intimate relationship with, whether that's a physical or emotional. But when the abuser is really locking in to the targeted victim's emotions, and they're pressuring them or pushing them into a fast-moving, committed relationship, that's also a danger sign. But like I said, in Gabby's case, everything started out great, but things very, very quickly started to change pretty dramatically.
As a mom, one of the things that really bothered me when I was watching this, and I don't know if it's something you would consider an indicator, but when he stole her identification so that she could not go clubbing with a friend, first of all, it was like, well, that couldn't be resolved just with a conversation, as reasonable folks should do. But he felt that he had to take that step to force her into a position, contrary to her will. Do you take that to be a red flag?
Oh, absolutely. And remember, he did it under the cover of, I'm watching out for you. I don't want you to go out with these people because I'm worried about your safety being out there. And what he was doing, he was sowing a seed of doubt at the time. Like, well, I don't think your friends really have your best interest at heart. I have your best interest at heart. And to show how dedicated I am to you, I went to this extreme measure. But to your point, taking those documents was a very overt step in limiting her freedom, because think about what a driver's license or ID can do for a person. It allows them to have rights and abilities and access to many different things, many of those being resources or options. And that one little, it's actually a big step, but to other people, that one little step of that driver's license created a whole mass of doubt and forced decisions and limitations on her. And yeah, absolutely, I totally agree with you. As a mother, oh my gosh, that, or a father, I would absolutely be livid that someone would go to that step, to
And of
control
course,
that person.
at that point, she's also living in a different state.
Mhm.
So that could also be an impediment to her escaping the situation and going home ultimately.
Yeah.
Uh, Not that we don't think that she tried. I mean, that wasn't portrayed in the documentary, but it could have been one of those things that kept her long past the point when she didn't want to be there. Um,
Yeah, I mean, if she went to go, to get a hotel room, or if
mhm.
for some reason she did try to tap into some type of services, whether it's a homeless shelter or domestic violence shelter, or to secure maybe renting an Airbnb, renting a car just to get away. Where's your ID? Where's your driver's license? We have to confirm who you are. Well, I don't have anything. Well, I'm sorry, we can't help you. Again, so that document that we have as a privilege, not a right, really dramatically limits a lot of people. And I don't think many people really understand how much power that holds for an individual.
Right. And then when the police were called because someone observed Brian hitting Gabby, the subsequent traffic stop is just incredibly hard to watch, knowing what we do now. Of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, but the police in Moab initially saw Gabby as the aggressor, despite the 911 call. How common is it for law enforcement to misinterpret victim behavior? And how can we improve these responses?
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to admit this, but it's not uncommon for officers to misidentify who the true victim is compared to the aggressor. And really what it comes down to is training. Training is absolutely key in this area. And the reason it can be hard is because if officers are not trained to understand the overt and the subtle control tactics, and understand verbal and nonverbal communication between two disputing parties, if they don't understand that concept of language and understanding, it's very easy for the abuser to manipulate the situation, and it's also much easier for the victim to present a different picture as well than what really occurred. So training is key. Officers, when people become police officers, they don't inherently know who the victim is versus the abuser. Oftentimes, officers initially rely on visual indicators such as injury, like where is the injury, how severe is the injury, to determine who the aggressor is. But the reality is that just because someone has an injury and where it is and the severity of it doesn't automatically make someone a victim. Matter of fact, in my 26 and a half years of law enforcement and training in this area, officers need to reserve making a decision before they understand how the injury occurred, why the injury occurred. And there's been a lot of cases that I've investigated where the one who had the most severe injury in the most troubling area was in fact the aggressor, but because the victim demonstrated, and we were able to figure out the victim demonstrated a need to defend themselves, sometimes preemptively. People don't have to wait to get assaulted to defend themselves. I tell people, if you're walking down an alley and someone comes out from behind a giant garbage can with a knife and they're approaching you, they may never say a word, but they're walking to you with a knife over their head and you have no avenue of escape. Well, what does that visual tell you? It tells any reasonable person, I'm getting ready to get seriously hurt. I have no avenue of escape. Maybe I need to do something before I get seriously hurt. And again, when we simply rely on the visuals, we don't understand the whole picture. And also behaviors. Again, a lot of people, especially new officers, sometimes rely on demonstrated behaviors to determine who is primary aggressor and who is the victim. Is somebody crying? Are they mad? Are they frustrated? Well, if we make a bad assumption, if we assume that all victims are going to be crying, then we're missing a lot of victims, because not every victim is crying. Not every survivor is crying. Sometimes you're going to find that your survivor victims are actually very mad, and they're mad because they were put in a position that they were in. They didn't want to be in the position that they were in. They're mad at perhaps themselves. They're mad sometimes at the aggressor. They're mad at the situation. Sometimes they're mad at law enforcement because they didn't get there soon enough. Or maybe there's just, again, frustration. Sometimes there's no emotion at all. People that have gone through a traumatic event are sometimes their psyche and their psychology is still caught in a situation that they can't fully comprehend what happened. And so they're not catatonic by definition, psychological definition, but they're just, there's no emotional effect that they didn't demonstrate. And again, without proper training, some officers will tend to say, well, but they're not acting like a victim, so they must not be the victim. In the Gabby, Petito, and Brian case, look at the behaviors. Brian was respectful to the officers. Yes, sir. No, sir. Followed very compliantly, talked very, even keeled. There was no like super high inflection in his voices or wild behavioral movements. But in contrast, we look at Gabby, and she was very distraught, even to the degree that after there was some separation between the two parties, which is a tactic to help control the safety of the situation and to bring the emotional side down, she was still very distraught through the entire event. So officers need to be taught that their initial impressions can be false. Again, there can be very legitimate reasons that the victim is angry, not crying and distraught. Responses to trauma are varied, and injuries do not always tell the whole story. Another word of advice I give people is, just because someone hit first doesn't mean that they were aggressor. Likewise, the greatest injury is not always does not always mean that they were victim. And the key part of it is getting an explanation as to the why and how. So we try to teach officers, take what you see, don't make any assumptions, but take what you see and find out the why and the how, and then compare that to the scene or whatever other evidence that you have. And again, aggressors will try to manipulate the scene and explain away what happened. They try to control the narrative and what's being told. And this goes not just in what we call coded language. This is part of the separation of the two parties, is there are statements that can be made by the aggressor that don't sound aggressive, but to the victim survivor, they know that that terminology means a threat or retaliation if they speak. And this is, something that can be heard in earshot, not even with them looking at each other, but just overhearing. One story that I relate was, often abusers will target children or pets that the victim loves. Well, let's imagine for a moment that some coded language, the aggressor says something like, well, they forgot to feed the dog. Let's say the victim, all they hear is the word dog. In their mind, that attaches to, my pet's going to get hurt if I say something.
Right.
And that word, it doesn't mean anything else to anybody in that way, but to the victim who's been conditioned to understand what those words mean within the context of that relationship or situation. And then just visual indicators, things that may not be of a threatening nature between you and I, but as known to the victim, does the abuser wink in their eye, or smacking their lips, or rocking back and forth, or in one of the cases I'm familiar with, a shop towel. This particular male aggressor, he threw a shop towel, something that you clean oil off your hands. He just threw it over his shoulder. The victim understood that to mean that she was going to be strangled later, because that was the instrument that he used to strangle her. So when he threw that shop towel over his shoulder, and she saw that, it meant don't say anything or change the narrative to make it that the officer believe that there's not a problem here. So yeah, it requires a lot of training. It requires experience. It requires going on calls and being paired with people who know the subtleties of what these relationships are about.
Considering the injuries, the police in that situation noticed scratches on Brian's face. And to me, I thought that was an example of a defensive kind of an injury. Basically, somebody trying to get away. Now, I mean, I don't know if that's how a professional would see it or not. But of course, when they asked Gabby about her visible injuries, she repeatedly denied, either, oh, no, that's nothing, or, no, it's not new, whatever it is. Even when they said, have you been hit? No. She was so quick to take all the blame.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
that trauma response.
Yeah. And so part of it was due, and this is where I have some criticism of law enforcement. They didn't ask the right questions. Law enforcement officers, sometimes to try to move through the case rather quickly and get to the core issues, their intentions are good, but their approach is bad. And so the intention is, I see some things, let me ask some yes or no type questions, and that'll more quickly get me to what I need to know. And in fact, that's not really true. Those are called what we call leading questions and closed-ended questions. Those are not the type of questions to ask in a domestic event. When they said, did he hit you? That's what they asked of Gabby. Well, first of all, it suggested the answer. And again, that suggestion may be true, but it also can be argued that the officers led her to agree to what the officers thought versus what really occurred. So I don't like the approach to that question. Did he hit you? And even if she said yes, that doesn't tell us in the context of why he hit her. It doesn't tell us. There's no understanding as to whether he did it because he wanted to, if it was an accident or anything, or what her understanding of it was. So again, the way that they approached her was very leading and closed-ended versus the way that they approached him. If you watch where they approached it, oh, you have some marks on your face. They left it very open and kind of, to have him explain how that occurred. Because as an officer, I would want to know how that occurred. And you are absolutely right when you hypothesize that those injuries on his face could have been defensive in nature. We might get to this a little bit later on, but Gabby related to Brian grabbing her face. Now, again, we don't really understood. We didn't get any more detail on what that meant. I mean, if she says he grabbed my face, I would want to know where he grabbed her face, when he grabbed her face, how he grabbed her face. I mean, was that his hand over her mouth or just around her jaw, or was it, some type of neck hold or neck restraint? And let's imagine again, let's hypothesize for a moment if that was the case. He grabbed her by the face, maybe just to hold her jaw, maybe to keep her quiet. Maybe it was to cover her mouth so she didn't make any noise. Maybe it was to, in fact, strangle her. Well, what would most people do as a defensive measure to that? Well, there's two parts on a man's body that somebody defending himself will go for, and that's the groin and that's the face. And so for her, if they were both in a standing position, which all indications are that they were standing outside by a curb, somewhere in the public, the quickest, easiest place for her to stop him doing what he was doing would be to go for his face. And so it makes perfect sense that, again, we have to, the officers and the public now in this 2020 hindsight have to hypothesize what could be. And the hypothesis and the ideas that officers come up with is what guides their questions. And the responses to those questions is what guides the investigation. Officers shouldn't be guiding where they want people to go and making a case that isn't there. It's people's statements about what happened that should guide the investigation and ultimately lead the officers to their decision.
Are we asking too much of officers to ask them to see through so much when, when the verbal response is, it's my fault. No, I wasn't hit. Are we asking too much?
I don't think so, because this is the nature of their job. I tell law enforcement officers, you're in a position where your job is to be lawfully nosy. Many people say that, well, relationships are a private matter. Well, to some degree they are, up until the point it becomes criminal or happens in public. And when law enforcement gets involved, our primary duty is to hopefully prevent crime, but investigate crime. And because that's our job, we need to be lawfully nosy. So it is incumbent upon the officers, and it's their duty to go beyond the surface and dig further into the goings on and the understandings of the two parties to get clarity. Because that's the only way we make the best decisions. Now, are officers going to make bad decisions sometimes? Absolutely. It does happen. Officers are not going to get their decisions right 100% of the time, but the more effort that they put into understanding, the better the outcomes are going to be. And in cases where officers do make a mistake, and I've seen this plenty of times, when the truth reveals itself, which could sometimes come, hours later, weeks later, or months later, then make it right. Whatever mistake was made, you still have the ability to correct anything that was done wrong and hold offenders accountable and get victims the necessary resources. So I don't think we're asking too much. I just think it sometimes is a personal issue of, how driven the officer is, but balanced with how much training did they get in these understandings. Because again, you pull someone off the street and put them through the academy, they get some exposure, but that's not all the exposure that they need and all the exposure and understanding that they need to have, because the complexities of the law enforcement job are many. We're just talking about one aspect of an officer's job, investigating domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Frankly, society has asked law enforcement to be the problem solver of just about every problem. Whether it's a barking dog, or somebody smashed a mailbox, or dispute between neighbors, or, leaves blowing into someone else's yard, law enforcement's been asked to fix everything. But in this case, it is necessary to devote all the energy in exploring these cases as thoroughly as possible. Because think of what the outcome is. If we don't do our job, skill and ability, then what we're doing is we're potentially leaving someone in a very bad situation that's going to progressively get worse. And the continuum of violence theory within the realm of domestic violence and psychology is that relationships that are violent will continue to get more violent and will only end when someone leaves or someone dies. And that's the worst outcome there is. Again, we owe it to the public that we serve to be informed in this area, so we prevent it.
Many people expect victims to just leave, or maybe they expect them to behave in obvious ways. Can you explain how trauma affects a victim's ability to recognize or escape abuse?
Sure. There's many studies. There's thousands of studies that you could find online that relate to the effect of trauma on people. The fact of the matter is that trauma does in fact alter how the brain processes its decisions and its realizations. When you're exposed to trauma, there are actual chemical changes in the brain and different hormones that are released into the body that affect the processing of thoughts and memories. And that's what we call the neurobiology of our brains. And we're not going to go too deep into that, but just to let people know, there is a physiological, biological response to trauma. And many times traumatic events will switch our brain into what's called a primitive survival mode. And that affects our psychological responses as well. And this is what I mean. When we're not under stress, we're not under trauma, our brain has a better ability to operate in higher levels of reasoning, decision-making, evaluating. But in a survival mode, in a traumatic survival mode, the brain shuts off all those type of higher level decision making capabilities and simply focuses on survival. And that can cause people to, again, not make very informed decisions, or decisions that might, in other terms, people would see as detrimental to their own safety. And repeated traumas cause people to be desensitized to what their body and their mind is reacting to for months. And this is why, again, going back to what I said earlier, this is why sometimes we see people who are not responding to trauma like we would think, but they're disassociated, they're unfeeling, they're unemotional, because their body has been conditioned to deal with this stress. Where the first time, they went into a panic, they had tons of anxiety. Now that doesn't exist anymore. It's what we call classical conditioning to some degree, that some people are familiar with. And this is where, again, I can kind of relate law enforcement experiences. The first time a police officer is involved in a car chase, the way that they sound on the radio during the car chase is dramatically different than, 5 years or 10 years later when they've been in many, many different types of car chases. The body's learned to acclimate to that level of stress, and so they sound more calm. They're more clear-headed to some degree. So this can be misrepresented within the victim as, well, I guess nothing really bad happened. If we don't see these expected responses, the victim themselves, well, it wasn't that bad. It's kind of what I expected. But then the officers and other people might say the same thing. Well, they're not responding the way that we thought they would. Maybe nothing really happened. This person isn't behaving the way that I would expect. And here's the other thing too, is victims can often question their own judgment because of criticism and manipulation used by the abuser. So when the abusers have actually turned the tables, so to speak, on these traumatic responses and said things like, see, you can't control yourself. You can't maintain, what you're thinking, and you don't think straight. Well, now the victim's starting to question, well, am I even right am I right in any way to understand what's going on? And again, it's a conditioned response. And this is why these abusers are master manipulators. They take every situation, every response by the victim, which could be considered completely normal, and they turn it around to make the victim feel like they're abnormal in some way. So trauma has, again, a psychological effect, a biological effect in the short, long term, both with emotional trauma and physical trauma.
A survivor recently shared with me that when it came time for her to leave, and she did, her parents really didn't understand what was going on, because whenever she brought him around, she always painted the best picture. She always wanted to put him in a good light because she wanted them to like him. So then they found, the reality very hard to accept. And in some ways, that's kind of what we see with Gabby. Her social media painted this picture perfect life. How does the highlight reel of social media mask domestic violence? And how can we encourage people to recognize hidden abuse?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Well, simply put, people show you what they want you to see. And this is how it happened in the Gabby Petito case and a lot of other domestic violence type relationships. The abuser shows the one that they want to control what they want them to see. And with respect to social media, it's the exact same way. Gabby showed people what she wanted others to see. Now, we know that in finding some of the edited or unedited, I guess you would say, footage from her camera, there were times that she was distraught and upset and crying, but she didn't show that to everybody. We found that out after the fact. And social media makes it very easy for people to put on a show or presentation, and no one questions it. But it's just done to a different degree in some situations. Again, Gabby promoted what she loved. And it's not the full picture of going on. And we often, I would say all people to some degree put on a show, but for what benefit? When you go for an interview, you talk about you go for an interview for a job, you talk about the best of yourself. You don't talk about the worst of yourself. when we're, meeting new people, not necessarily relationally, other than maybe acquaintances or maybe in a business setting, we show the best of ourselves. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about this, Callie, is that if these abusers and these victims are putting on a front, putting on a facade, that takes energy. It takes energy. It takes a conscious decision and energy to maintain this picture, this facade. And often victims and abusers themselves can't keep up that effort 100% of the time. So there's going to be cracks in the armor, as I call it. There's going to be cracks in the presentation from time to time. The problem is, if you're not looking for those cracks, you're not going to see them. And friends and family who are this support network and this core of a victim survivor's way to get out of this, if they're not actively seeking, if they're not actively viewing, if they're not actively evaluating, they're not going to see the cracks. But when there is a concern, if there is a crack, if there is a discrepancy, that's where the level of awareness needs to rise, and there needs to be a questioning or an inquisition. By questioning, like, hey, I saw this, what happened? Just, non-judgmental, non-leading, but just, hey, we saw something different. I think, again, in retrospect, if friends and family of Gabby had seen all those videos that were never shown, if they saw bits and pieces of those, they would have known something was going on, but they didn't. And that's really, really hard when people are actively putting forth a persona, but that isn't true.
What kind of training should law enforcement receive to better identify and intervene in domestic violence situations?
Well, let's talk about intervention for a moment. Intervention comes in one of three ways when it comes to law enforcement. There's direct disclosure, and that's where someone calls law enforcement directly and tells them, I need your help, or in fact, domestic violence or something is going on. The other way that it happens is by a third party. And that's where, again, a concerned individual, whether it be a friend or family or even stranger, and again, in Gabby and Brian's case, it was a stranger who happened to observe this interaction where a man slapped a girl or a man hit a woman, and they called. Because, again, it was very clear that Gabby and Brian didn't call. It was a third party. And then we have direct observation by the law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers are encouraged to be proactive and observant of their surroundings to pick up on problems as they are starting or before they start. So the number one training officers should get, aside from these understanding the three ways of intervention, or the three ways that officers will be informed of these, is to know how to interview and question people. In other words, what to look for. Again, if you're not taught what to look for, and if you're not taught how to ask questions, it's very, very difficult. Again, I'm reiterating a little bit, but when officers are asked those leading questions, they're really limiting their understanding. And patience is key. So questioning of knowing and being inquisitive, getting an explanation as to the why and the how of what is being seen by the officer. Again, I could speak on that for days. I know we don't have time, but questioning is training how to do it is very important. Patience is very key as well. A slow and deliberate approach is best for two reasons. Officers, on daily calls, officers do get a lot of calls for service. And this is sometimes why they want to speed up, because they have things backing up. But when it comes to these intimate partner and domestic violence, slow and deliberate is best. For number one is safety. Officers moving too fast into a domestic violence or intimate partner type relationship actually jeopardizes the safety, not just of the officer, but the parties involved, because of actual physical violence that can occur. And the second thing is the realization that trauma can inhibit someone's ability to communicate well. There can be times where there's deliberate false statements because the victim's in fear of the abuser and trying to protect the abuser. And creating sight and sound separation between the two parties is the first step in making the scene safe, so that people can speak freely without any type of verbal and nonverbal threats being conveyed between the two parties. And this also helps to build rapport, to try to set people at ease. And this is what the officers try to do in Gabby's case. They got that separation done relatively quickly, sight and sound separation. Brian was back at the truck. Gabby was back at the patrol car. Now, to correct that a little bit, when Brian was asked to the back of their vehicle and Gabby was on the passenger side of a patrol vehicle, they could still see each other, which I don't really like very well. But the basic understanding of a deliberate approach to the two people, asking Gabby to get out, move to a different area, Brian to get out, move to a different area, were some ways to start safely controlling the situation for all parties on the scene, and to try to build the rapport that the officers need, so we get communication going. I mean, if officers go up very hard and fast and demanding and confrontational, they're not going to get the conversation that they need. But this is what I found very, very interesting. This ties back to some conversations we just had. Aside from trying to create a safe environment and build the rapport, part of the design was hopefully to see how the two parties reacted. And if you remember, as I said earlier, and you saw, during the entire event, Gabby was saying that she's fine, I'm normally calm, but she was distraught the entire time. Even when the officers created, a fairly safe environment, she was still distraught the whole time. And that doesn't match well for what we would expect. If there wasn't trouble, then the emotional side would likely have come down, but it didn't. And that's one of those, again, indicators and flags that officers are picked up on. But again, the officers needing to know the what, the how, and the why is critically important, and the most important skill paired with observation. Take what you see and get an explanation for what you see, that you have a higher level of understanding.
Now, I have to tell you, at the end of that traffic stop, as a mom, I found it absolutely heartbreaking that they sent him to a motel and they sent her off alone in her van to go camp for the night.
Mm-hmm.
Although I realized they were following procedure, they even had a conversation about how they were going to handle the situation. What did you think of that?
I had some trouble with it. So in that documentary, when there was a conversation where some officers on their body camera were in the car, and one of the officers said something about that they don't have discretion in cases like this. Now, what that means is, in most states, in South Carolina, it has that. South Carolina before 2015 had a mandatory arrest provision. It said when there were physical manifestations of injury present on the victim, there must be an arrest. That was pre-2015. The law has been changed now to reflect the word may arrest. So when there's physical manifestation of injury on the victim, officers may arrest. The reason that changed in South Carolina is because of something I said earlier. Officers were incorrectly determining the victim too quickly based on injury. Oh, you have an injury, you don't, you must be the victim, you're the aggressor, you go to jail. What was happening was some victims were going to jail because they created an injury on the aggressor preemptively or out of a need for self-protection. But the law was like, well, there's injury. So we have to correctly determine who was the victim. And it seemed to some degree that the officers on the scene didn't feel very strongly about their impressions. They almost seemed like there was some self-doubt there. Like, although Gabby was expressing that she was the cause of it all, they weren't really sure. Well, if they weren't really sure, they should have gone back and investigated until they were sure. Now, the last thing that an officer wants to do is put a victim in jail or arrest someone unlawfully when there's no probable cause. So it seemed that the officers, in finding a way out of the situation to perhaps limit their own perhaps liability, was to separate the two parties, not arrest a suspect who they didn't have enough probable cause on, and to not arrest a victim and put them in jail that would have been even more detrimental. So what they decided was, well, let's send the party on their separate ways. The interesting thing is that what they did with Brian is what you should do with someone who's a victim of abuse. You get them a safer place. And I know, at least in this state, if you were to take someone to a domestic violence shelter, or you used some of the processes that we have in South Carolina to get a victim a hotel that is not a domestic violence shelter, they have to be determined to be the real victim. And so I don't understand how the provisions were made, or what justify the provisions to give Brian a hotel room seemingly separate and apart from the incident location in a safer place, and Gabby's just left by herself in this van. Now, we've talked previously about this, but Gabby, I believe, was the registered owner of that vehicle.
Right.
Now, they could have thought, well, if we leave Gabby in this vehicle, she has an opportunity to be away from someone that's problematic. She has an opportunity to keep driving many, many miles away and actually create a large distance of separation. I don't know. I had a very hard time in the way that was handled, and they just, I think, operated in a ways that they were very unsure of themselves, and to play it safe, they just separated the two parties. When in fact, we know after the fact that he was definitely the aggressor. I think the officers, with the right training, and at least to my perception, with the training that I've had and I train on, I think I would have correctly determined who the aggressor was in that situation. But I was very, very troubled by that. I mean, Brian was given pretty much every resource that the victim should have been given, when in fact he was actually the aggressor in that case, and to me had many more resources to call from than her.
If someone suspects a loved one is in an abusive relationship, what are the best ways to support them without putting them at greater risk?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would say be consistent with your encouragement. Do not be judgmental. It's very easy for friends and family to criticize the targeted victim. You always pick the wrong people to be with, and you're always asking me for stuff. I mean, again, it's not a time to be judgmental, but encouraging and empowering. So be consistent with that. Be available when they need to talk or vent. Listen, but also see if they're open to your ideas and thoughts. Sometimes friends and family are so quick to offer advice when that advice simply just isn't going to work in that situation. And many times the victim has never been asked by the abuser what their opinion is or what their thoughts are. So when you listen, respond in a way of, well, would you like to hear what I have to say? Would you like to hear some of my thoughts and ideas about what you're going through, or ways that we can make it better, or I can help you? And kind of put some power back in the victim's court, so to speak. And even if they're not open at the time, and if they're truly, truly resistant over time, there may be an opportunity where you have to be a little more forceful. But again, we don't want to be overly bearing. Simply tell them, hey, I'm concerned for your safety. I saw some things that, I don't think you want to talk about right now, but these are the concerns that I have, the things that I've seen, and these are some resources that I have for you, whether, again, it's personal resources or tapping into some community resources, whatever it is, offer that to them. Sometimes you're going to get victims who will take it and you think that they don't look at it. Truly, after they leave, they may throw it in the garbage, but there's going to be a lot of them out there who will take those resources and the information that you gave and kind of rest on it for a little bit and look at it at a different time when they're ready or when they're able to, because obviously when the abuser is around, they can't look at it. But share your observations and try to help them see the clearer picture. Again, a lot of times people in relationships are operating through rose-colored glasses and they're not being objective. But be factual, be truthful, be loving, be encouraging, and not judgmental or abusive. The last thing, again, that a victim needs is someone acting in an abusive way because of their intent to help and frustration. Again, we have to somewhat put ourselves in the victim's shoes, and that's what a lot of people with good intentions don't do. Well, you need to do this, you need to do that. Well, can the victim do that? Are they thinking the same way you are? And likely it's not true. So you kind of have to get down on their level in many, many ways.
What can society do to better educate young people about healthy versus unhealthy relationships in order to prevent domestic violence before it starts?
Well, education is absolutely key to breaking this cycle. I mean, some of the best lessons in life are learned inside the home. I mean, quite frankly, that's what's so critical about the parental role in the house is most of your most critical decisions on your future are started with that decision making in the home. But we also have to understand that some people don't have that environment to learn from that parental relationship. And even when that parental relationship is there, parents don't feel comfortable talking about some of these issues and they shy away. So whether it's in the privacy of the home or in the public realm of education, we cannot shy away from these issues, because to do so keeps this progression of cycle ongoing. It empowers the abuser, and we don't give people the information that they need. Some people's normal is our abnormal. People say, well, what is normal? Well, you talk to every person, their normal is different than your normal. For some, normal for them was the screaming and the yelling, the abuse in the house that they grew up in. That's normal. And that's what, they sometimes grow up to be. Not always. It used to be that it was said that if you grew up in an abusive home, you grow up to be an abuser. Well, that's not necessarily true by research, but we know that there is a likelihood that someone who experiences abuse in the home will be an abuser, but sometimes that may also be someone we would consider a victim, but it also could be someone who becomes an advocate. So we actually see three outcomes from abusive type relationships. But education within the home, education within the public, and this is where society needs to step in. Society needs to step in when the familial home learning isn't there, and society needs to be more frequent and open. In other countries like the United Kingdom, New Zealand, they do a great job of putting out public service announcements funded by the government to address on primetime news the topic of domestic or intimate partner violence and even strangulation. So I think society needs to do a better job of that. In South Carolina, we generally only hear of domestic violence in a more broad societal sense during October, during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. But the reality is that should be going on all the time on our radio, on our TV, not just the awareness of what things are bad, but also what are good. What are healthy relationships? But what are the signs of abuse and control? What are the resources to get help? And it needs to be done with regularity, not just in the educational systems, but healthcare systems, the employment setting. I mean, literally every environment that a person can exist in, at their job, at their school, at their home, and just walking out in public, it needs to be more frequent and more open. Because if we just ignore it and we don't expose it for what it is, society and individuals will never make headway to overcome it. it truly is like putting the light of truth on something. It's like the whole thing about a 12-step program for addicts. Admitting you have a problem is the first step. Well, we have to admit that this is a national problem. It is a societal problem. It is a state problem. It is a city problem. It is a personal problem, and we have to call it out for what it is, and then educate around that, provide the educational support around that, so that everyone is up to speed and everyone has an understanding.
Now, this investigation ultimately revealed that Gabby was murdered by means of strangulation, which is something we see far too often. Strangulation is an indicator of future homicide and nothing to play around with. In this case, it was the means by which homicide was committed. Are there warning signs that can help us identify someone prone to this behavior before things get physical?
Yeah, there are some. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And as we said earlier, it can be very hard to pick up on that when someone's showing you only what they want you to see. But, demonstrated cruelty towards pets in their early years would tend, and it does tend to show a red flag of how that person is going to interact with people, if you're harming pets. And certainly here in South Carolina, we actually have a couple cases that relate to that here most recently in the last 5 or 6 months, that there were patterns of abuse towards pets, specifically strangulation, that should have been a huge warning sign. Cruelty to others, any type of sadistic attitudes, anytime that there's a feeling of a person that they're unaccountable for their decisions, like, I can do whatever I want and nobody can, nobody's going to tell me what I can and can't do. So any type of suicidal thoughts or expressions. This is a huge indicator, because I tell everyone, if someone is suicidal, they're potentially homicidal. And when someone utters words that indicate they want to harm themselves, what that's telling you is their psyche has already had that debate. You can't express that thought in words if your brain did not first think up a scenario or a situation where that would be acceptable. So when it comes out of the mouth, the mind is already halfway there. Any type of direct physical threats towards people, any type of words of threat. If I can't have you, no one will, or just, saying that you're going to punch somebody or choke somebody, even though choking is not the correct terminology. That's what people mean by strangulation. Any type of direct words of threat is a huge red flag. Excessive possessiveness. Someone always wanting to know where you are, what you're doing, who you're talking to. Accountability for time, location. Where are you? How long have you been there? The demands to be checking in. And, we haven't even gotten into the point of talked about, technology these days. It is scary, the type of programs and apps and just basic functions of a person's cell phone or their computer that allows them to be tracked knowingly or surreptitiously.
Right.
And so possessiveness of any degree, that again is excessive. And sometimes that's presented as, well, I just care about you so much. I'm just so worried about you. I just want you to know, I just want to know where you are all the time, because I just want to make sure you're okay. And early on, a lot of victims take that to mean, oh, well, they really, really care about me. They really, really love me, that they just want to spend every moment with me and make sure that I'm safe. But there comes a time that most people realize that this is getting to be a little too much, or a little too quick, that someone's exercising this type of control or understanding over me. And then, of course, when it comes to strangulation, just understanding that there's external injuries that we may associate with that. Petito hemorrhages in the eyes, which are the ruptured blood vessels in the eyes, scrapes and marks on the neck, petito hemorrhages on the surface of the skin or hidden in the hairline. But I want everyone to understand that if we simply rely on these external injuries as to whether strangulation took place, we're missing over half of the actual signs and symptoms. A lot of the signs and symptoms are going to be a lot more subtle that indicate internal injury, such as speaking with a hoarse or raspy voice, not being able to breathe, not being able to swallow, having gaps of memory or memory deficit, pain in the neck and head area, even the petechial hemorrhages in the mouth or the back of the throat, in the back of the eyes, which only doctors would see actually with an eye exam, and it can even cause behavioral changes, because when the brain doesn't have its needed oxygen and brain cells die due to lack of oxygen, if there's a loss of consciousness, it actually is detrimental to the brain's function. So we see sometimes people, their personalities change over the long term because of actual brain damage. So there's some things that can be very overt, and some things that can be much more subtle. And the reality is, though, is there's training out there to for law enforcement officers and professionals in the public to pick up on some of the subtleties that I mentioned.
Now, I know this is something that you spend a lot of time working on. So what legal or societal changes would you most like to see to better protect victims of domestic violence, especially when it comes to strangulation? And how can our viewers support your endeavors?
Well, thank you for this opportunity to speak on that. Well, societal change is mass education across professions, especially a higher probability to encounter someone who was strangled, that being law enforcement, paramedics, EMTs, doctors and nurses, victim advocates. Those would be the people that would be most prominent or at higher levels of frequency to encounter someone who's been strangled. But we also have to recognize that people that are strangled are not always going to call those professions. Sometimes it's going to be the hairdresser, your makeup person, your teacher, trusted friend or family. So that's why I say across all professions, but then in the broad sense, a more public awareness about the subtle signs and symptoms of strangulation. But again, particularly defined and structured curriculums within the public service profession. So mass awareness campaigns would be something I would suggest, both in print and news media, public service announcements on multiple platforms. Again, relating to those subtle signs, symptoms, and dangers, and that there are interventions that can take place before a strangulation occurs. But when it does occur in South Carolina, we need to have a specific law for this form of assault. And as of yet, South Carolina doesn't have that. 49 other states have statutes that specifically define what strangulation is and have directed specific penalties. And South Carolina is not there quite yet. Myself and others have been working in South Carolina for nearly 8 years to pass a strangulation bill into a law. And what we want is a standalone felony strangulation law, not a law that is tied in and mixed under some other existing statute, because that tends to kind of muddy the waters a little bit. And we need something more specific. And with all that we know about the dangers of strangulation, again, not all the viewers here will know all those, but the people that need to know, which is again our legislative body, doctors, nurses, paramedic, EMTs, and everything. With all that we know, it's unconscionable to me that we have not fixed this problem yet. So we need a law. Now, fortunately, currently, as we do this interview, there is a bill in the South Carolina House Bill 3522, that would make a specific statute for non-fatal strangulation. It would be a 3-year felony, because when someone's strangled, whether they lose unconsciousness or not, the risk of death or great bodily injury is high. Actually, even higher than someone shooting at you with a pistol or a gun. So we think so it definitely needs to be qualified as a felony. We're looking at a 3-year felony. The wording that has been introduced would also make some aggravating circumstances to increase to a 10-year felony if there was a prior conviction of strangulation or if there was an existing order of protection or a restraining order. And so the statutes need to allow for enforcement, accountability, and prevention. Enforcement would come from a specific charge, which would lead to accountability for that specific act. And the prevention mechanism comes two ways. Number one, the statute or the bill that's been introduced would require at least law enforcement to advise strangulation victims as to the signs, symptoms, and dangers, and suggest through statutory mandate that they get immediate medical attention. The other prevention it offers is prevention of future homicides. If we can intervene during these non-fatal strangulation events that are the number one indicators of future homicide, if we intervene at this point, hopefully we prevent a homicide in the future. And it also would help us track strangulation in South Carolina. Right now, South Carolina doesn't have a good mechanism to track strangulation because we don't have specific codes and specific laws. Well, this bill, if it's passed into law, would help fix that and make it easily trackable. I was informed the other day that apparently there is some senators on the Senate side that plan on pre-filing a companion bill. So if we can get an agreement on the House side, an agreement on the Senate side, if we have a higher chance of success of passing this bill into law. And since both houses have to agree to forward that to the governor for agreement and signing into law, if we've got advocates on both sides of the house, we have a better chance of success. But ways that people can help support this movement and be informed is I have a Facebook group page, and it is the title of that group page is Strangulation Law for SC. So just the abbreviation for South Carolina. And on there, you ask to join the page, and there I provide legislative updates. I provide information on non-fatal strangulation, statistics, training videos, training links that can help everyone be informed of what's going on and how they can help. And so I ask people to go on there, join that page, share the information that you learn and are exposed to, because it truly does save lives. The other thing I would tell people to do is call and email your legislators. It's easy to do. All you have to do is go to the South Carolina legislative website. You can do it different ways. You can type in your address, you can search your county, and you will have identified not just your senator, but your House representative for your area. And then there's another portal on there where you can call their office and email them messages. And I would suggest doing both, just as a matter of increasing that level of frequency. Call their office. I've never called any of their offices where their staff wasn't nice and pleasant and accepting of the messages, but also following that up with something in a written message as to voicing your concern about this non-fatal strangulation issue and encouraging them to support this law to save lives in South Carolina.
It sounds like after 8 years, it's going to take a big push.
It is. And truly what it's going to take is going to be the raised voices of citizens in South Carolina and the constituency of each of these legislative members. The House and the Senate have been given information and data from many sources, some of which I provided, some of which that others provided. But to some degree, it hasn't gotten, I guess, the necessary attention yet. But I really think the power rests in the voice of the people. So the more people that are informed, the more people that voice concern and demand some type of action, I think the better chance we have.
And of course, there are so many reasons why this is important. Brittany Drexel, Micah
Yeah.
Francis Miller, Jessica Barnes, and we could go on and on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
We have a lot of cases in South Carolina that reflect the dangerousness and the homicidal rates of non-fatal strangulation and what it leads to.
Well, thank you for joining us again for another important discussion inspired by Micah Francis Miller. I always learn so much from you, Brian, and I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Certainly. If anyone has a question for Brian about domestic abuse issues, please email me at callie@fitsnews.com, as we intend to continue this conversation in hopes of providing practical information and guidance for victims and their loved ones. As we wrap up, it's clear that domestic violence is more than just physical abuse. It's about control, manipulation, and power. The tragic case of Gabby Petito serves as a stark reminder that the signs of abuse are often misunderstood, overlooked, or dismissed until it's too late. But awareness is only the first step. We must do more to educate, to intervene, and to support victims who may feel trapped and powerless. Whether it's through better training for law enforcement, stronger legal protections, or simply recognizing the red flags in the people we love, every action counts. To anyone listening who may be in an abusive relationship, you are not alone. Help is available. There are people who care and want to support you. If you or someone you know needs help, please reach out to resources like the National Domestic Violence Hotline or a local support service in your area. For now, stay informed, stay safe. For FITSNews, I'm Callie Lyons.